Emily had been a flight attendant for over 20 years, yet she had never seen someone like him. He was not the kind of passenger she usually dealt with. The elderly man moved slowly up the aisle, and Emily noticed how he gripped the armrests of the seat as if each step required a decision. Each breath seemed labored. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, the way they scanned the cabin, the passengers, the flight attendants. There was something calculating in his gaze, like he had seen more in his life than most could ever imagine. But he wasn't speaking about it, he wasn't showing it. But Emily couldn't help but feel that he was measuring everything around him, taking stock of each person. She watched him settle into his seat by the window. But his eyes never left the world outside. He had an air of deep thoughtfulness, like he was waiting for something or someone. She tried to push the thoughts from her mind. She had a job to do, the usual routine, the safety checks, the drink service. But there was something about him, something about the way he seemed so alone, yet so focused in a world that was so chaotic. The other passengers had started to chat, laughing, enjoying the flight, but he sat in complete silence. Emily's instinct kicked in. She kept glancing back at him each time she passed, noticing how he seemed to shrink into the seat. Even though his body was so frail, his presence felt much larger than his small frame could suggest. It was unsettling in a way she couldn't explain. She kept walking up and down the aisles, doing her duties, but her thoughts kept drifting back to him, his name. She hadn't even caught his name, yet the paperwork said Mr. Hargrove. But that meant little to her. She had served hundreds of Mr. Hargroves in her career, but none had ever felt like this. None had ever made her feel like she was on the edge of something big, something she couldn't quite understand. She glanced over at the man once more and saw him staring at her as if he had been waiting for her eyes to meet his. The brief moment of contact sent a strange chill through her. She immediately turned away and walked towards the galley, trying to focus on the task at hand. But her mind kept wandering back to him. Something felt off. His posture was so stiff. It was almost unnatural for someone of his age, and his clothes, they looked slightly too new, too neat for someone traveling alone. She found herself wondering why someone of his age would be traveling alone so far from home. Surely someone who had lived as long as he had would want companionship. Wouldn't they? Why the solitude, the isolation? She knew she had to approach him and at least offer something, a drink or a snack. It was part of her job after all. But as she approached his row, her heart began to race. She felt her palms go slightly clammy, and for the first time in a long time she hesitated. She took a deep breath and smiled, trying to keep her composure, and said, "Mr. Hargrove, would you like some tea?" He turned his head slowly towards her, his face still unreadable, but those eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment she saw something flicker there, a hint of recognition, a flash of something hidden deep within him. But then it was gone, replaced by a calm smile. He nodded politely and said, "Tea would be nice, thank you." His voice was soft, almost raspy, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that didn't match his appearance, and Emily felt her curiosity grow stronger. The way he had said it made her feel like he wasn't just some random elderly man asking for a drink. No, it was as though he was testing her, seeing if she could hear the unspoken message in his words, as if the words themselves weren't the point, but the moment of connection, the briefest acknowledgement that she had just crossed into something else, something bigger than this flight. She felt an uneasy shiver run down her spine, but she turned away quickly and headed back to the galley to prepare his tea. The entire time she couldn't stop thinking about how she had never felt this way about any passenger before. The quiet man in 4D was different, and Emily had a sinking feeling that this flight would be one she would never forget. Emily returned to the galley, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared the tea. She could still feel his eyes on her. Even though she wasn't looking at him, she kept stealing glances over her shoulder, trying to see what he was doing. But each time she turned around, he was simply staring out the window, his expression unreadable. The quiet hum of the plane and the murmurs of passengers filled the cabin, but all Emily could hear was the pounding of her own heart as if it were trying to tell her something she couldn't ignore it, was the way his presence made the space feel smaller, more confined, as though he was pulling the very air around him into his own orbit. She forced herself to concentrate on the task at hand, pouring the tea into the cup. But her thoughts kept drifting back to him. Why had she felt that strange chill when their eyes had met? Was it just her imagination, or was there something more to it? Was he someone important, someone she should know about? But hadn't she had a sense that he wasn't just any elderly traveller, but the kind of man who had lived a life far beyond anything ordinary? She wasn't sure why, but she felt it in her bones, and that feeling grew stronger with every passing minute. After a few moments, she returned to his seat with the tea, and stood in front of him. He glanced up at her for the briefest second. But this time there was something different in his eyes, something deeper, like he was seeing through her, seeing into her. It was the kind of look someone gives when they know far too much about you, even if they've never met you. Before his lips curled into a polite smile. But his eyes never left hers for a moment longer than usual. It made Emily's breath catch, as if she were standing on the edge of something terrifying. She handed him the tea, but didn't move away immediately. She stood there just a little too long, and in the silence of the cabin, she could feel a tension building, like something was about to break. The elderly man slowly lifted the cup to his lips, and took a small sip, before setting it back down. With deliberate care, he didn't thank her, or offer any words of acknowledgement, just a small nod. And then he returned to his window, staring into the distance again, as if she were no longer there. Emily took a step back, but couldn't bring herself to leave. She watched him for a moment longer, wondering what was going on behind those eyes. And then it happened. She noticed something odd. The reflection of his face in the window wasn't quite right. His features seemed sharper than they should have been, his eyes a little too intense, his posture a little too straight. It was almost as if the man in the reflection wasn't him, but someone else entirely, someone younger, someone with a presence that made her feel small. She blinked quickly, and the image was gone, replaced by the frail old man she had been serving. But the feeling lingered. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and for a moment she felt like she was part of a story she didn't understand, like she had stumbled into a narrative far beyond the confines of a simple flight. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought it was just her mind playing tricks. But the nagging feeling wouldn't leave. She tried to focus on her duties, returning to the galley again. But it was impossible to ignore the strange pull she felt toward him. She could feel his gaze on her once more, and each time she looked up, she saw him watching her, carefully measuring her movements, with a quiet intensity that unnerved her. Was he waiting for something she couldn't see? Was he aware of something she didn't know? Emily felt the unease creeping deeper now. It was no longer just a strange feeling. It was a knowing deep in her gut that something was wrong, something was hidden beneath the surface of this flight and this man, and she was desperate to uncover it, but she didn't know where to start. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but she tried to push it aside. As the flight continued, there were still hours left to go, and she had a job to do. But every time she glanced at the elderly man, she felt that strange weight in the air, as if the very atmosphere was different. When he was around, she tried to distract herself by speaking with the other passengers, but her mind kept returning to him. She couldn't help it. There was something magnetic about his presence, something that drew her in no matter how much she tried to ignore it. She passed by him again, and this time she noticed his hands. They were resting on the armrests of his seat, but the skin was thin, almost translucent. The veins stood out like they had been there for years. She thought about how fragile he seemed, yet there was an undeniable strength in him, something behind those eyes that told a different story than his appearance suggested. She couldn't help herself. She found herself standing a little closer than usual, watching him carefully. As he stared out the window, his fingers twitched ever so slightly, like he was holding something back. She was about to turn away when she heard him speak. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it sent a shiver down her spine. "You're wondering who I am, aren't you?" His words were not a question, But a statement Emily froze. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't said anything out loud, but somehow he knew it was as if he had been reading her thoughts. All along she felt a knot form in her stomach, and her instinct told her to turn and walk away, but her feet stayed rooted to the floor. She could feel his eyes on her, even though she wasn't looking at him. And it was as though he was waiting for her to respond. Something inside of her urged her to ask. But she couldn't find the words. She had no idea what to say. She hadn't expected him to speak to her like this. She had only been trying to do her job. And yet now she felt like she was in the middle of something much bigger than a routine flight. "I've lived a life that most people will never understand." He continued, his voice steady, but with a hint of something deeper in it, a weariness that came from years of carrying secrets. "I've seen things you wouldn't believe, places you could only dream of, but I've chosen to disappear. I've chosen to be forgotten." His eyes flickered to hers briefly before returning to the window. Emily stood there in stunned silence, trying to process his words. They didn't make sense. He was just an old man. Wasn't he just a traveler, like so many others? But somehow she felt that this man was anything but ordinary. And now he was telling her he had been someone important, someone who had lived through things that most people would never even imagine. She could feel her pulse quicken as the weight of his words sank in. What was he saying? What did he mean by disappear? What was he hiding? Why did he say all of this to her out of nowhere? Was it just the ramblings of an elderly man? Or was there something more to it? She tried to find her voice, but it wasn't there. She simply nodded, unsure of what to say next. But that wasn't enough for him. He turned to her fully now, his gaze intense and focused. He studied her for a moment, as though he were looking into her very soul. And then he spoke again. "You're the first person to notice," he said quietly. "Most people don't pay attention. They're too busy with their own lives to notice the ones who don't belong, the ones who are out of place. But you noticed, didn't you? You're not like the others." His words struck her like a bolt of lightning. Her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure if she should feel honored or terrified she had noticed him. But why would he say something like that? Why would he choose to confide in her of all people? Was it a test? Was he waiting for her to react? Did he expect her to do something, anything? But she simply stood there, staring at him, unsure of what to do next, unsure of whether she was truly ready for whatever was about to unfold. Emily felt her breath catch in her throat. The words hung in the air like a weight she could barely hold on to. And she couldn't tear her eyes away from him. His stare was unwavering, like he was waiting for her to respond. But she didn't know what to say or how to feel. Her mind was spinning too fast, each thought crashing into the next, trying to make sense of what he'd just said. Most people don't pay attention. What did that mean? Why had he said it like that? Was it a warning, or just the ramblings of an old man who had lived too long with his secrets? Emily took a deep breath and forced herself to focus on the here and now. But the tension in the air was suffocating. She could feel it all around her like a cloud she couldn't escape. She glanced at the other passengers. They were all going about their business, unaware of the strange conversation unfolding just a few rows ahead of them. They were laughing, chatting, watching movies, oblivious to the undercurrent that seemed to pulse just beneath the surface. Emily looked back at the elderly man. His gaze was still fixed on her, and it felt like the room had grown smaller, like the space between them was narrowing with each passing second. She couldn't help but wonder what he meant by disappear. What had he been running from? Why did he hide his true identity for so long? What could he have possibly done that made him think he could never return to the world he once knew? Was he dangerous? Was she standing in front of someone with a past darker than she could imagine? Or was he simply a man who had been lost in time and regret? She felt a knot form in her stomach as she realized she had no way of knowing, and the uncertainty was worse than anything she could have prepared for. Still, she didn't walk away. She couldn't walk away. Something inside her told her this moment was important, that she was on the verge of discovering something bigger than this flight, something that would change everything in a way she couldn't yet understand. As she stood there frozen in place, the elderly man spoke again, his voice quieter now, but somehow more intense than before. "There are people out there who will do anything to make sure I stay forgotten." He said, his eyes flickering briefly to the passengers around them. "They've erased everything, they've wiped out all traces of me, made sure no one remembers who I am. But there are always those who notice, the ones who see through the cracks in the story, the ones who remember." He paused, and for a brief moment it looked as though he might say more, but instead he looked back out the window, his expression unreadable again. Emily's mind raced. There were people after him, people who wanted to erase his existence. What had he done to deserve that? What had he been a part of? What secrets was he carrying? What if he was lying? What if all of this was some elaborate tale to trick her, to get her to do something he wanted? What if he was just a man telling his story to anyone who would listen? Or maybe there was something more to it. Maybe he was telling the truth. Maybe he had lived a life so dangerous, so secret, that it had cost him everything. She wanted to ask more. She wanted to press him for answers. But she didn't know if she could trust him, or if she was ready to hear the truth. Was she ready to dive into the unknown, to open the door to a past that might be better left forgotten? Yet she couldn't ignore the pull. She felt the need to know more, the need to understand who this man really was, who he had been, before he became this quiet old traveler with nothing but his memories and his hidden truths. She took another step closer, unsure of what would come next, unsure of where this conversation would lead. But one thing was clear: she couldn't walk away, not now, not when the mystery had her in its grip, and she had already come too far to turn back. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside her since their conversation. She had always prided herself on being able to handle any situation, but now, standing there in front of this man, she felt like she was losing control. Her mind was racing with questions, too many questions, all of them tangled together, and none of them having an answer. What had he meant by erased? What had he done to make people go so far to bury his existence? Why was he choosing to tell her all of this? Why now? Why? Her heart pounded in her chest, and her breath felt shallow. She knew she had to move away. She knew she had a job to do. But something kept her rooted to the spot. The silence between them stretched on like an eternity, and she felt the weight of his words heavy on her shoulders. She had seen people with secrets before, passengers who kept to themselves, who didn't want to be noticed. But none of them had felt like this. None of them had made her feel this, drawn in this, connected to something so much bigger than herself, something dangerous, something unknown. But the elderly man just sat there, staring out the window, his face still unreadable, his hands folded neatly in his lap. And yet there was something in the way he held himself, something in the way he was always so still, so controlled, that made her wonder if he was waiting for something, if he was expecting something to happen soon, or if he was simply biding his time, waiting for the right moment to speak again. She glanced at him once more, and this time she noticed something that made her skin crawl. His eyes flickered to her, and just for a brief second she saw something in them, something that wasn't fear or sadness or even resignation. It was something colder, something darker, something that made her question whether he was truly as harmless as he appeared. Maybe he wasn't the frail old man she had assumed. Maybe he was a man who had spent his life hiding, waiting for the right moment to reveal himself. Emily didn't know how long she stood there staring at him. She only knew that the longer she stayed, the more the tension in her chest grew tighter. It felt as though the room itself had become smaller, suffocating her. As she tried to process everything that had happened so far, it felt like a dream or a nightmare. She couldn't decide, and she didn't know which one she'd prefer. But her feet refused to move, her body refused to obey her desire to walk away and forget it all. The pull to stay, the pull to understand it, was too strong. She had to know more. She had to know what he meant, what he was hiding, and most importantly, why he had chosen to speak to her of all people, as if she could somehow unravel the mystery that surrounded him. She took a deep breath, and tried to steady herself. But the moment she did, she felt his eyes on her again this time. There was no mistaking it. He was watching her carefully, studying her every movement, as if he could see into the very depths of her soul. She looked away quickly, but the damage had already been done. The feeling in the pit of her stomach had grown into something worse, something more unsettling, as if she were being watched not just by him, but by something else, something that lurked in the shadows of the plane, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Her pulse quickened, and her breath grew even more shallow. And just as she turned to walk away, he spoke again, his voice barely audible, but it cut through the air like a blade. "You should be careful who you trust." He said his words low and chilling. "There are people who won't let you walk away from this. Not once you've seen too much, not once you've noticed what you weren't meant to notice." She froze. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. His words echoed in her head over and over again. And with each repetition, the weight of what he was saying sank deeper into her bones. She had known she was caught in something bigger than herself, but hearing those words spoken aloud made the reality of it settle over her like a dark cloud. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know who to trust, and she certainly didn't know if she should trust him. But something told her she was already too far gone to turn back. Emily stood frozen in place, her heart pounding in her chest, as the man's words reverberated in her mind. "You should be careful who you trust." His voice still echoed in her ears, and the weight of what he had said hit her with the force of a sudden storm. She had always prided herself on her ability to read people, but this man, he was different. He wasn't just an ordinary passenger. He wasn't just some frail old man. He had secrets, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized she didn't know anything about him. Not really. She didn't know where he came from or what he had done to make people want to forget him. And why was he telling her all of this now? Why had he singled her out? Why had he chosen her to listen to his story? Her instincts screamed at her to walk away, to leave him to his thoughts, but her body wouldn't move. It was as if her feet were glued to the floor, and the pull to stay close to him was stronger than any rational thought. She glanced around the cabin, hoping someone else had noticed the tension in the air. But no one seemed to be paying attention. The other passengers were still chatting, laughing, oblivious to the conversation that had just taken place. Emily took a deep breath and slowly turned back toward the elderly man. She wasn't sure why she was doing it, but she couldn't help herself. She had to know more. The need to understand was growing stronger than ever. She took a tentative step forward, and this time when she spoke, her voice trembled slightly. "What do you mean, people won't let me walk away? What are you talking about?" Her words felt heavy in the air, like a challenge, like she was daring him to reveal something more, something that would explain everything. The man didn't immediately answer. He simply sat there, staring out the window, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the armrest, his expression unreadable. It was as if he was deciding how much to reveal, how much he should trust her with. And Emily couldn't help but wonder why he had chosen her. Why not someone else? Why her? What made her different from all the other flight attendants or passengers in this plane? The silence between them stretched on, and Emily felt the seconds drag by like hours. Her pulse was racing in her ears, and she could feel a cold sweat forming on the back of her neck. Just as she was about to ask again, the elderly man spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "They are watching you," he said without turning to face her. "They are watching everyone on this plane, but they're especially watching you." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Emily's breath caught in her throat. She felt a shiver run down her spine as the full weight of his statement sank in. Someone was watching her. Someone knew about her. Someone knew what she had seen, and she hadn't even realized it. She hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary until now, and yet now she felt it in every fiber of her being. There was something about this flight, something about this moment, that was different from anything she had experienced before. Her heart raced as she looked around the cabin again. But everything seemed normal. Everything seemed just like any other flight, yet deep down she knew it wasn't. She could feel it. She could feel the eyes of someone or something on her, and it made her stomach turn. She took a shaky breath and asked the question she had been afraid to ask, "Who's watching me? Who are they?" But the elderly man didn't answer, not right away. Instead, he simply reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small photograph. He handed it to her. Without a word, Emily took it hesitantly and stared at the picture, her hands trembling, as she saw the image of a young man standing on a busy street corner, his eyes staring directly into the camera with an intensity that made her stomach twist. But it wasn't just the man in the photo that caught her attention. It was the background, the blurred faces of people in the distance, the way they seemed to be looking right at her, as if they knew she was there, as if they knew she would one day see this photograph and understand something that she couldn't yet grasp. Her mind was racing as she tried to process what she was seeing. Who was this man? And why was this picture being handed to her? What was she supposed to do with it? And why now? Why had the elderly man given it to her? She felt her hands shake even more as she held the picture in her palms, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger and stronger until it was almost unbearable. She looked at the elderly man, who was watching her with those same calculating eyes, his face calm. But his presence, like a storm waiting to break the photograph, slipped from her hands and landed softly on the floor, and she couldn't look away from it. She couldn't look away from the man in front of her, as she realized that whatever had been hidden from her was now out in the open, and there was no going back. Emily stood there, staring at the photograph on the floor, her mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The man's words still echoed in her ears, "They are watching you." But it wasn't just the words that haunted her. It was the photograph, the young man in the image staring at her with such intensity it felt as though he was looking right through her, as though he knew her better than anyone else ever. She bent down slowly to pick up the photo, her fingers shaking uncontrollably as she lifted it from the floor and held it in front of her once again. The man in the picture was young, maybe in his 20s, with dark hair and piercing eyes. But it was the background that made her skin crawl. The people in the background were blurred, but their faces were all turned toward her. It was as if they knew her presence was important, as if they had been waiting for her to see this image. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She was a part of something bigger, something that had been set into motion long before this flight, and she had no idea how deep the rabbit hole went. She looked at the elderly man, but his gaze was no longer on her. Instead, he was staring out the window again, as if the conversation was over, as if she had already heard what she needed to hear. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an ordinary encounter, that there was something sinister at play, something dangerous. She felt a chill crawl down her spine as she realized she had been drawn into something that might cost her everything. She took a deep breath and tried to steady her nerves. She had to ask him more. She had to understand why this was happening, why her. She had to know who the people were that were watching her, who they were, and what they wanted from her. But just as she opened her mouth to speak, the overhead light flickered for a moment, casting the cabin in an eerie dim glow. She froze, looking up at the light, but before she could even react, the cabin door at the front of the plane swung open. Emily turned quickly and saw one of the other flight attendants stepping into the aisle, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. Something was wrong. Emily's heart skipped a beat as the flight attendant walked toward her and the elderly man with quick, hurried steps. It was clear something had happened, something that had shaken her to the core. When she reached them, she glanced nervously at the elderly man before turning to Emily, her voice trembling as she spoke. "They're here." The words barely escaped her lips before she glanced over her shoulder, as though expecting someone to be lurking in the shadows. The hair on the back of Emily's neck stood up. She felt a cold shiver run down her spine, and she instinctively stepped back from the flight attendant. "Who's here?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but the other woman just shook her head as if she couldn't say it out loud. "They're on the plane," she whispered urgently, her eyes darting around as if she expected to see something or someone that wasn't there. "They'd been following us for days." Emily felt her stomach drop at her words. She felt as if the ground beneath her was crumbling away, and she was falling into the unknown. Her eyes flicked to the elderly man who hadn't moved a muscle, but the cold calculation in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. He knew what was happening, he knew what was coming, and he'd have been waiting for it, waiting for the right moment to reveal it all. Emily turned back to the flight attendant, who was now looking around the cabin nervously, as if she was trying to gauge who could be trusted, and who might be working with them. But before she could ask anything else, the flight attendant's voice dropped to a whisper again. "The people from the photo," she said quickly, "they're here, and they're watching everyone on this plane, but they're focusing on you." Emily felt her blood run cold as the pieces started to fall into place. The people in the photo, that they were real, they were on the plane. And now they were watching her. She didn't know what to do or who to trust. But she knew one thing for sure: this flight had become something far darker than she could have ever imagined. She looked back at the elderly man. But he was already gone. His seat was empty. His presence had vanished into thin air, like a ghost disappearing into the shadows. And all that remained was the photograph in her hand, the silent warning that everything was about to change forever. Emily stood frozen in place, the photograph still clutched tightly in her hand, her mind spinning as the flight attendant's words echoed in her ears. "The people from the photo, they're here, and they're watching everyone on this plane, but they're focusing on you." The weight of it all settled on her shoulders, like a heavy blanket, suffocating her. She had known something was off, but now she understood just how deep this went. The elderly man had vanished without a trace, and with him went any sense of safety or certainty. She had the flight attendant was still looking around the cabin, her eyes darting from passenger to passenger, as if trying to determine who was a threat and who was not. Her hands shook slightly, and Emily could see the fear in her eyes. But there was something else too, something darker, a sense of knowing that chilled Emily to the bone. She had to know more, had to understand who these people were and what they wanted from her. But before she could speak, the flight attendant leaned in closer, her voice barely a whisper. "They're not just watching, they've been waiting for you." She said the words carrying an air of dread. "They knew you would be on this flight. They've been planning this for a long time. And now they're here." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She felt a cold sweat break out across her forehead. The realization that she was being hunted, that she'd have been marked from the start, sent a wave of panic through her. She wanted to scream, to demand answers. But the flight attendant's next words stopped her cold. "You don't know who they are, but they know everything about you, everything." Her eyes met Emily's, and for the first time Emily saw something like regret flicker in them, something that spoke of a deeper knowledge, something that made Emily realize this woman had been in the game far longer than she had ever imagined. Emily opened her mouth to ask another question, but the flight attendant suddenly straightened her back and shook her head. "I can't help you," she said, her voice thick with fear. "If I do, they'll know I've told you, and they'll come for me too." The words hit Emily like a slap. She felt her world begin to crumble around her. The people she had trusted, the people she had relied on all her life, now seemed like shadows in a twisted game. She hadn't signed up for the flight attendant, turned abruptly, and hurried down the aisle without another word, leaving Emily standing there alone, her mind a whirlwind of questions and terror. What was she supposed to do? How was she supposed to survive this? Who could she trust? The seatbelt sign chimed, suddenly flashing above her head, but it felt like a distant sound, like an echo of something that no longer mattered. The plane was still hours from landing, and Emily could feel the tension in the air grow thicker with each passing moment. The passengers around her were still oblivious to the danger closing in on them, but she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. She glanced down at the photograph, still in her hand, and the faces of the people in the backgrounds seemed to shift as if they were alive, watching her. She turned it over, hoping to find something, anything that could explain what was happening, but the back of the photo was blank, except for a single word written in faded ink, the word "remember." She felt a chill run down her spine as the meaning of the word settled in the connection. She had felt earlier the sense that she was being pulled into something much bigger than herself. All of it was coming together now. She was the one being watched. She was the one they were waiting for. But why her? Why now? What had she seen? What had she stumbled upon that made her so important? She needed answers. She had to find the truth.